So Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the prodigy, you probably know that he was very famous from an early age, and maybe you know that he died very young when he was 35. Um, so Mozart was, sorry, I got to make the window active. Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria, which was to the south of Germany. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from a book called Bach, Beethoven, and the Boys. It's just music history as it ought to be taught. This author is all about presenting it in a accurate but very fun way, and describing things as he believes they really were. So here's a little excerpt. January 27, 1756 was pretty much a day like any other, until about 8 p.m., when the greatest prodigy music has ever known was born to Leopold and Maria Anna Mozart in a little third-floor apartment which they rented from a grocer. The baby's name was Johannes Chrysostomos Wolfgangus Theophilus, but he preferred Wolfgang Amadeus. Little Wolfgang did not start out being particularly remarkable. In fact, for the first 3 years, he was quite ordinary. He wet his pants, played with his food, and slobbered on his shirt front just the same as any other small child. Until he was nearly 4, he was a complete slacker. He didn't compose note music and hardly played the harpsichord at all. But by age 5, he had rolled up his shirt sleeves and gotten down to some serious work. He became a whiz at the keyboard and began composing simple pieces. The sound of a solo trumpet would send him screaming from the room, and he wasn't very fond of the flute either. So Mozart's first teacher was his father, Leopold, and they began when Mozart, as I read in here, was 4. And to make some extra money while Mozart was growing up, he and his father would actually and sister would actually travel around the countryside and perform for others. So Mozart would play the piano, his father would play the violin, and his sister would sing. And when Mozart was 7, he had his first piano sonatas published. A sonata is just a form of music. You can do some research on that if you choose Mozart. Now, at age 12, Mozart had written his first opera. An opera is very similar to a musical, where it's on stage with actors and sets and scenery and all that kind of stuff. It's just pretty much all singing. There's not much talking, though. We'll talk some more about that coming up. Mozart traveled to Italy when he got old enough, and here he learned about Italian opera. Mozart is actually most famous for his operas, at least in the in the classical music realm. And again, operas are like plays, but they're all music, and there are mainly 2 types of songs. There are songs called recitatives, which moves the story along with action, words, and drama. So they would still be singing it, but they would sing it essentially on one pitch. It wouldn't move very much, and it was very free. The orchestra would just hold notes, and you would sing a little phrase. And this would progress the opera in terms of the story, in terms of the drama. It would move the story along. Whereas arias were songs about emotion, about what the character was experiencing and what the character was thinking about. In fact, it wasn't out of the ordinary for an actor to sing about dying for minutes. In fact, there's an opera that Richard Wagner wrote. He's a German composer in the Romantic time period, and in that song, like, somebody dies, but they stop and sing about it for a little bit, and then, like, the love of their life then also sings about this person dying, and then the other person who actually is dying sings again about dying, and then he finally dies. So it, like, from the time he gets, I don't know, stabbed with a spear or whatever, it takes 15 minutes for him to actually die. So it's kind of funny how the time and the arias kind of stretch out for a long time. So I'm going to attach a YouTube clip of The Marriage of Figaro. This is actually an aria that I sang. It begins with a recitative, which furthers along the story and the content, and then the aria just kind of sings about some action and some drama in there. And the basic premise to this clip is that the man and the woman you see in the clip are about to get married. They're just measuring their room and figuring out how they're going to put their furniture in there. And the man is quite pleased with the arrangement. However, the woman is a servant in the count's castle, or in the count's household. And this count is kind of making advances towards this woman, and she's uncomfortable with that because there's this kind of older tradition that's called prima nocta, that the count or the lord of the house could sleep with the woman like on the marriage night before the husband slept with her. It's, very scandalous. You think we have problems now, they had problems and weird things that happened back then. And so the husband, the guy, finds out about this, and he sings a song called Se vuol ballare, signor contino. So it's essentially, Count, if you want to dance, I will dance with you, and I will fight you, like, to not let this happen. So that's kind of the premise of that aria and of that clip. Operas are incredibly long and complex. They're in 5 acts, sometimes take 3-4 hours. And if you think a modern movie is complex, or a modern musical is hard to follow, operas were just way, way worse. I've actually seen The Marriage of Figaro, and it's quite long, and I needed the transcript to read to follow it. So, in his earlier adult life, however, Mozart actually struggled to make money. He wasn't famous just because he was a child prodigy anymore. He was like a teenager, an adult, and he wasn't, a child anymore, so people didn't necessarily need to come see him. Mozart had a horrible time trying to make something of himself. I'm going to read again from this book. Mozart never got the prestigious court appointment he knew he deserved. He worked for a while at the court of the Archbishop of Salzburg, until one day he got uppity with the Archbishop's executive assistant, who kicked Mozart out, literally right in the seat of the pants. His status in the Archbishop's household was that of any other servant. Composers were not considered any different from valets or serving girls. In a letter to his father, Mozart explains the etiquette of dining. By the way, the 2 valets sit at the top of the table, but at least I have the honor of being placed above the cooks. And so this also came into our discussion about Beethoven last fall when we were singing this Ode to Joy. Musicians were always thought of as servants. They weren't higher than, a family member, and so they were treated as employees, and they weren't fancy at all. And people like Mozart believed that they needed higher status. Beethoven, of course, did that as well, and that comes into play. So he was always a great composer, but no one really believed in him, and he was always kind of stuck in his status. Later, as he wrote more music, operas in particular, he began to make money, but he was still horrible at managing it. Like, he would just spend it frivolously, so he was always poor, even if he was making a lot of money. Now, when Mozart was becoming a well-known pianist, he and Haydn decided to have a contest. So Haydn was a teacher, and he taught both Mozart and Beethoven. And so all of these composers kind of knew each other back in that day. And here's the contest. Each of them, Mozart and Haydn, tried to write a piece that the other one couldn't play. And so it went back and forth. And Haydn wrote a seemingly impossible piece of music. However, Haydn was able to play it. So this song had scales starting in the middle of the piano and just going towards the edge of the piano. But then as your hands were all the way at the edge of the piano, there was like a middle C that just happened. And Mozart was like, you can't play this. You sit down and play this. And Haydn did. And what he did was he reached in with his nose, and as his hands were out here, he just hit that note with his piano, and then the scale, or hit the note on the piano with his nose, and then those scales came back in. And so Haydn, won that contest, just because Haydn was kind of humorous like that. Mozart is also very famous for the piano pieces that he composed. They are very characteristic of the classical era. Tuneful, elegant, simple melodies and accompaniment. Here are 2 sonatas that you need to go listen to that you are probably familiar with, some of his more famous works. In 1791, at age 35, Mozart began to get sick. However, he kept composing. He was actually working on a requiem. Unfortunately, he died before it was finished, but one of his students finished it for him. And a requiem is essentially a funeral song, and this song was performed at Haydn's funeral. So Mozart was so poor that he actually left his wife with debt. But his wife became a very good businesswoman after he died. So just like with a lot of these composers, they didn't earn a lot of money outside of what they were paid to do their jobs. So when we purchase a piece of music nowadays, that composer gets some money for that. But back then, people weren't necessarily buying a lot of this music to perform. They just would go to a concert to hear his music that he had composed. And so Mozart's music really didn't become super famous until after he died. And that's when a lot of people started to want to buy the music and perform it themselves. But his wife had control of all the music that he wrote. And so she controlled this. She controlled the publishing and all the information about that. And so she did become very rich because of that. And of course, today Mozart leaves a legacy of the most incredible child prodigy that classical music has ever seen. Composing at age 4, it's just absolutely ridiculous. What were you doing when you were 4? I have no idea, but not being amazing like Mozart. That should hopefully give you some good stuff to go start researching about Mozart. Go read a Wikipedia page, do some more research, and let me know if you have any further questions about some things from Mozart.